Hey there, welcome. I'm here to help you relax tonight. So before you get too cozy, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It really makes us feel like the global community it is. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's begin our evening together. Story 11. The Forgotten Drawing. The dust motes danced in the slanted afternoon light, swirling like tiny ghosts as Emily pushed open the attic door. The air was thick with the scent of decayed paper, mothballs, and the faint, sweet smell of old cedar wood that had once lined her grandmother's hope chest. This was her final, solemn task, sorting through the tangible remnants of her grandmother's life before the estate sale could begin. Gran had been a hoarder of memories, a curator of forgotten moments, and every box promised a journey into a past Emily wasn't sure she had the strength to revisit. Each item was a thread in the tapestry of a life that had ended too quietly in a nursing home, leaving behind this labyrinth of memory. She spent hours sifting through relics of a life lived long before her own, sepia-toned photographs of unsmiling relatives staring into a future they couldn't possibly predict, bundles of letters tied with faded ribbon that whispered of loves and losses she would never know, porcelain dolls with cracked faces and vacant eyes that seemed to follow her movements in the dim light. It was exhausting, melancholic work, a conversation with ghosts who refused to speak. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across the cluttered space, her fingers brushed against something cold and smooth tucked away behind a stack of crumbling National Geographic magazines from the 1970s. It was a small, wooden box, unlike the others. It was crafted from dark mahogany, carved with intricate, almost Celtic patterns that seemed to tell a story of their own, and sealed with a small, brass clasp that was tarnished green with age. It felt out of place, personal, and secretive. It opened not with a creak, but with a soft, definitive click, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded crimson velvet that was worn thin in places, was a single child's drawing. It was rendered on coarse, brown construction paper with the waxy, enthusiastic strokes of Crayola crayons. The drawing depicted two stick figures holding hands under a lopsided, smiling sun that dripped yellow rays. One figure was labeled Emmy in a child's shaky, uncertain script. The other was labeled Benny. Scrawled in the corner was a date from over 30 years ago. Emily stared at it, her breath catching in her throat. A cold, inexplicable knot tightened in her stomach, a primal dread that had no source. She had no memory of this drawing, no memory of a Benny. She was an only child. She'd had no cousins named Ben, no childhood friends by that name. The nickname Emmy, that was what Gran had always called her, a name she'd abandoned in her teens for the more mature Emily. It was a private name, a family name. Yet, here it was, preserved like a sacred relic in her grandmother's most private box, hidden away from the world. Why? Who was Benny? Her fingers trembled as she turned the paper over, the cheap construction paper crackling softly. On the back, in her grandmother's elegant, looping handwriting, a handwriting she knew from birthday cards and recipe files, was a short, cryptic message that made the blood drain from her face and her heart stutter against her ribs. We must all forget the accident. For Emmy's sake. For both of them. Never speak of it again. The word accident echoed in Emily's mind, a dissonant chord struck in the silent, dusty attic, reverberating through the years. It felt like a key turning in a lock she never knew existed. She sat back on her heels, the drawing held delicately in her hands as if it were made of glass, her mind racing through the foggy archives of her childhood. She had no memory of any significant childhood accident. There were the usual scraps and bruises of any active child, a broken arm from falling out of the old oak tree in the backyard at age 8, a story told and retold at family gatherings, but nothing that would warrant such a secretive, desperate note. Nothing that would require the complete erasure of a person named Benny from their family history. This note spoke of a pact, a conscious decision to bury something profound. A deep, unsettling unease took root in her chest, spreading cold tendrils through her veins. The cozy, familiar attic, once a place of childhood exploration, suddenly felt alien and threatening. The shadows in the corners seemed to deepen, pooling into shapes that hinted at hidden secrets and silent tragedies. The doll's glassy eyes no longer seemed vacant. They seemed knowing, accusatory. She had to know. After her parents died in a car crash when she was 12, Gran had been her sole guardian, the keeper of all family history, the teller of all stories. What other stories had she withheld? What other truths had been buried alongside her parents? The following morning, dawn breaking in a palette of pale pinks and oranges, Emily drove to the town's historical society. The night had been sleepless, filled with half-formed images of a dark-haired boy and the chilling feel of icy water. The building was a small, colonial-era house that smelled of lemon polish and aging paper. An elderly volunteer with kind eyes and wire-rimmed glasses named Agnes helped her locate the microfiche archives of the Havenwood Chronicle, the town's weekly newspaper that had chronicled births, deaths, and everything in between for over a century. Agnes left her alone with the machine, its hum a constant, low drone in the quiet room. Emily started with the date on the drawing, her heart thumping a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The screen flickered, showing society events, weather reports, and local advertisements for hardware stores long gone. Nothing. She worked backwards, then forwards, her eyes straining against the blurry, green-on-black text. She felt a growing sense of desperation. What was she even looking for? An accident? A fire? A drowning? The word from the note echoed in her mind. Accident. And then she found it. Not on the front page, not with a banner headline, but a tiny, 2-inch blurb buried on page 7 of an edition from a month after the date on her drawing. The headline was small, unassuming, yet it screamed at her from the past, each word a hammer blow to her soul. Local pond tragedy. A tragic accident occurred yesterday afternoon at Miller's Pond. 2 children, siblings, were playing on the ice when it gave way. One child, Benjamin Benny Reed, age 5, was recovered from the water and pronounced dead at the scene. His sister, Emily Reed, age 4, was rescued by a neighbor and is reported to be in stable condition at County General. The family has requested privacy during this difficult time. Emily Reed. Her name, Benjamin Benny Reed. His name, siblings. The room tilted on its axis. The hum of the microfiche machine faded into a distant, meaningless roar. She read the article again and again, each word etching itself into her mind with acid clarity. The words siblings and Benjamin Benny Reed hammered into her skull, breaking apart the foundation of her identity. She had a brother. She'd had a brother. And he had died. And she had been there. She had been there, and she had lived. And she had forgotten. No. The chilling realization washed over her, colder than the imaginary water in her fragmented memories. She had been made to forget. The memories didn't come flooding back in a coherent, merciful narrative. They leaked into her consciousness like poison, drop by terrifying, isolating drop. She stumbled out of the historical society, the world outside a blur of meaningless color and sound. She barely made it to her car before her legs gave way, and she sat in the driver's seat, trembling, the steering wheel feeling alien under her numb hands. A sensation of biting cold that seared the lungs, a cold so profound it felt like fire. The sound of cracking, a sound like 1,000 bones breaking, echoing across the frozen expanse of the pond, a sound that ripped through the silent winter air. The terrifying, breath-stealing shock of plunging into icy, black water, the world suddenly upended, muted, and deadly. The thick, heavy, suffocating feel of a waterlogged winter coat pulling her down into the darkness. And a face, a small, panicked face under the surface, eyes wide with a terror she could now feel in her own soul, a stream of silver bubbles escaping from his parted lips. A small hand, reaching for hers, fingers brushing against hers in the freezing water. She jerked back from the memory, gasping, her hand flying to her mouth as if to stifle a scream that was 30 years too late. The car felt suddenly suffocating, the windows fogging with her panicked breath. She fumbled for the door handle and stumbled out, leaning heavily against the hot metal of the car, gulping in the fresh autumn air as if she were still drowning. She had a brother. His name was Benny. He had died, and she had been there. The guilt was immediate, crushing, and absolute. It filled the hollow spaces inside her, spaces she never knew existed, with a leaden, unbearable weight. Had she dared him? Had she run out too far onto the thin ice, laughing, reckless, leading him to his death? Had she struggled against him in her panic, pulling him under? The article was vague, but her mind, fueled by a newfound and horrific grief, supplied the worst possible scenarios. She was the survivor. She was the one who lived. And that, in itself, felt like a crime. She drove back to Grant's house, now her house. In a daze, the world outside the windshield seeming unreal, a poorly staged play. She marched straight to the attic, a woman possessed, pulling down every box, every photo album, every forgotten trunk. She was an archaeologist of her own erased history, desperate for any shard, any fragment that proved Benny had existed. But there was nothing. No pictures of a dark-haired little boy with eyes like hers. No family portraits with a second child grinning beside her. No tiny shoes tucked away in a box. No small jackets hanging in the back of a closet. It was a systematic, meticulous, and horrifyingly complete erasure. Her parents and her grandmother hadn't just hidden the truth. They had scrubbed Benny from existence, vacuumed him out of their history with a terrifying efficiency. Forget the accident. For Emmy's sake, they thought they were protecting her, shielding her from the trauma. But in doing so, they had stolen her brother from her twice over. They had left her to grow up in the silent, ghostly presence of an absence she could never name, a loneliness that had always felt like her own personal flaw. She had always felt like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit, and now she knew why. There had been another piece, and he had been lost. She found herself in her old childhood bedroom, the room that had always felt too big, too quiet for just one child. She looked at the wall where two beds might have once stood. She looked at the closet, large enough for two sets of small clothes. She looked out the window at the old oak tree, its branches now bare, and wondered if Benny had ever climbed it with her. Had he been here? Had he laughed in this room? Had they whispered secrets to each other in the dark, plotted adventures, fought over toys? Had he been her best friend? The grief hit her then, not for the boy she remembered, but for the brother she had never known she'd lost. It was a fresh, sharp, agonizing pain for a 30-year-old wound that had never been allowed to heal. It was a phantom limb screaming in agony. She sank to the floor of her old room, surrounded by the ghosts of a childhood that had been a lie, and wept for Benny. She wept for the life he never got to live, and for the life she had lived without him. The house was too quiet that night. Every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the settling foundation, sounded like a whisper. Emily lay in her old bed, the same bed she'd slept in as a child, but it felt unfamiliar, tainted by the day's revelations. Sleep was impossible. The drawing was on her nightstand, the two stick figures a silent accusation in the moonlight. When she did finally drift into a fitful sleep, the dreams were vivid, hyper-real, more memory than fantasy. She was small again. She could feel the rough, itchy wool of her red mittens, see the weak winter sun glinting off the icy surface of Miller's Pond, making it look like a field of diamonds. The air was crisp and cold, smelling of snow and pine. And he was there, Benny. His cheeks were rosy with the cold, his smile gap-toothed and infectious. He was holding her hand, his mitten-clad fingers intertwined with hers. He was real. He was solid. He was her brother. "Don't let go, Emmy," he said, his voice clear as a bell, untouched by time or tragedy. It was a voice she knew in her soul, a voice she had loved. Then the sound, the terrible, sharp crack that ripped through the perfect winter silence. The world fell away beneath their feet. The paralyzing, breathtaking cold of the water as it swallowed them whole. The shocking darkness, the frantic bubbles, the desperate, panicked thrashing. She woke up with a gasp, sitting bolt upright in bed, her heart pounding like a drum in her chest. The dream lingered, clinging to her, more real than the room around her. She could still feel the icy water on her skin, still see his terrified face. She got out of bed, drawn by a force she didn't understand, a pull she couldn't resist. She walked through the silent, dark house, her bare feet cold on the wooden floors, down the stairs, and into the living room. Moonlight streamed through the bay window, illuminating the room in shades of blue and silver, painting everything in an ethereal, otherworldly light. And there, sitting on the faded Persian rug in the middle of the floor, was a child. He was translucent, shimmering faintly like a reflection on water. He had dark, messy hair, and was wearing old-fashioned corduroy pants and a striped sweater. He was drawing on a piece of brown construction paper with a white crayon, his head bent in concentration. He looked up. It was the face from her dream, from the pond, from the deepest, most hidden chamber of her heart. Benny. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. He just looked at her with sad, ancient eyes that held a wisdom and a pain no child should ever know. Then he held up the drawing. It was the same picture from the box, the two stick figures under the sun, but he'd added to it. Now, dark, scribbled blue lines, crude, frantic waves, covered the ground beneath their feet, and the two figures were no longer holding hands. Their arms were outstretched, straining towards each other, but separated by a jagged, black crack that split the paper in two. He pointed a faint, shimmering finger at the crack, then at her. Then he pointed at himself. A sob caught in Emily's throat, raw and painful. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking, tears streaming down her face. "Benny, I'm so sorry. It was my fault. I'm so sorry." He tilted his head, as if considering her apology. Then, slowly, deliberately, he shook his head. It wasn't an acceptance. It was a negation. A correction. "That's not it. That's not what happened." He pointed at the drawing again, specifically at the hand of the figure labeled Emmy. Then he pointed at her own hand, her living, breathing hand. He wasn't blaming her for the accident. He was showing her what really happened. The memory didn't just return, it replaced the old one. It didn't leak. It exploded into her consciousness with the force of a dam breaking, washing away 30 years of lies and guilt in a torrent of terrifying, liberating truth. It wasn't her fault. They had been together on the ice. It was thin, and it had cracked with a sound that still haunted her dreams. They both fell in. The cold was shocking, 1,000 needles piercing her skin, stealing the breath from her lungs. She was flailing, sinking, disoriented in the murky, green darkness. But Benny hadn't been just panicking under the water. He had been fighting, swimming, not for himself, for her. Through the terror, she saw him, his small face set with a determination that belied his age. He had grabbed her by the wrist, his small hand incredibly strong, an anchor in the chaotic, freezing water. He had kicked hard, pushing her, shoving her upwards with all his might towards the jagged, light-filled hole in the ice. She had broken the surface, gasping and choking, her lungs burning with the cold air, where Mr. Peterson from next door had seen her and rushed out, pulling her onto the solid ice. But the effort had spent Benny's last breath, used up his final reserve of strength. The current from her own frantic kicking had pulled him away from the hole, under the thick, unbroken ice. He couldn't get back. He was trapped in the freezing darkness. She hadn't let go of his hand. She had held on, screaming his name, her small fingers locked around his wrist even as Mr. Peterson tried to pull her away. He had let go of hers. She felt it again, the ghost of that sensation, his fingers, once tight around her wrist, slowly loosening their grip. A deliberate, heartbreaking release. He had looked at her through the ice, his eyes wide, not with terror anymore, but with a sad, desperate love. And then he was gone, swept away into the dark. He had saved her. He had chosen to let her go so she could live. The ghost of her brother watched her as the truth settled over her, warm and heartbreaking and liberating all at once. The guilt that had defined her for a day, and unknowingly, for a lifetime, evaporated, leaving her feeling weightless and raw. It was replaced by a grief that was clean and pure and immense. A grief for the hero he had been, for the life he had sacrificed for hers. He smiled then, a small, sad smile that held the echo of their life together. It was a smile of forgiveness, of love, of peace. He held up the drawing one last time. The angry blue scribbles and the jagged black crack faded away, melting from the paper until it was just the two stick figures again, holding hands under the smiling sun. Whole, together. Then he began to fade too, his form dissolving into the moonlight, becoming one with the silver beams streaming through the window. "Don't go," Emily pleaded, reaching out for him, her hand passing through the shimmering air where he had been. "Please, Benny, don't leave me again." But he was gone. The room was empty. The only thing left was the feeling of his small, cold hand letting go of hers, not in abandonment, but in ultimate sacrifice. And the profound, echoing silence of a love that had waited 30 years to be remembered. She didn't try to find more evidence. She didn't need to. She knew. She finally knew her brother. Not as a ghost, not as a tragedy, but as a boy who had loved her enough to die for her. She went back to the attic and found the wooden box. She took out the drawing and carefully, tenderly, smoothed it out. She found a simple frame and placed it inside. She hung it in her living room, right on the wall above the spot where he had appeared to her. It was no longer a monument to a forgotten trauma. It was a testament, a memorial to a love that not even death could erase. She would never forget again. She would tell his story. She would say his name, Benjamin Benny Reed, her brother, her hero. And sometimes, in the quietest moments, when the moonlight streamed through the bay window just right, she could almost feel him there with her, holding her hand, finally at peace.